Robert Hammond is one of the friends of the High Line. He's co-founder of the Friends of the High Line. And as mentioned, the High Line is a very special project in New York. And I think it was by individuals that started the idea, isn't it? Because it was deconstructed, and then they said, no, we have to keep this for the city. And now it's one of the most attractive parts of New York. Besides the Empire State Building, the second thing tourists are visiting at this moment, isn't it? A lot of people, yeah. And it's very interesting because the High Line is very often a very beautiful example mentioned in the Netherlands of another way of approaching and looking at the city. So we are very honored and very happy that you're here. Ladies and gentlemen, may I have a very warm applause, Robert Hammond.
Well, thank you for having me here, and thank you. I apologize for not speaking Dutch. It's embarrassing, but thank you for staying with me. So I'm going to give you a really quick, brief history of the High Line, and we're going to talk about some of the successes, but I also want to talk about some of the things that have not worked, because I think success is boring, failure is far more interesting. So the High Line is an elevated rail line that runs through 1.5 miles of New York. The train used to run down on the street, and it was known as Death Avenue because so many people were run over by the street that they got a guy on horseback to ride in front of the trains. You could see how it would be so dangerous. And then they elevated it. They raised it above the street to save people's lives. And it was always a freight line. It was never a subway or carrying people. It was called the Lifeline of New York because it brought mostly food into the city. But with the rise of interstate trucking, it was used less and less. And the last trainload of cargo was a trainload of turkeys for our Thanksgiving. That's what we eat at Thanksgiving, in 1980. And I moved to New York City in 1993, and this is what I saw. This rusting piece of structure. I sort of thought of it as, it's like, the Rome has the aqueducts, we have this thing. And then I read this article in 1999 that it was going to be demolished. And I saw a little map that showed it was 1.5 miles long. And I just assumed someone would be working to preserve it. It turns out there wasn't. So I went to my first community board meeting, which is like the smallest level of local government. And I sat next to this guy who I didn't know, Joshua David. And no one in the meeting was interested in saving it. Most people just wanted it to tear down. So I said, why don't you help save it? And he said, why don't you do it? And so we exchanged business cards and decided to do it together. That was 19 years ago. We hadn't been up there. This picture was taken later. But we went up there and we found 1.5 miles of wildflowers, running through the city. And that's when I really fell in love with it, because it was this amazing sort of decay. And I think it was, some people saw ugliness in this, some people saw beauty. And it was, to me, that real tension between old and new, man-made, and nature. But most people wanted to tear it down. I don't know if y'all know this man. He's hated even more now than he was then. Mayor Giuliani, he's Trump's best friend now. But he was also a bad mayor that most people don't realize. They think he saved 9/11. It's not accurate. But he wanted to tear down the High Line. And he actually signed a demolition order 2 days before he left office. And actually, most of the developers in the neighborhood, the real estate owners, also wanted to tear the High Line down. So then Michael Bloomberg came in office as our mayor. He was more open, but he was also a business guy. He didn't care about the pretty pictures and the wildflowers. He wanted to know that it made economic sense. So we did an economic feasibility study to show that the tax revenues to the city would be greater than the costs. So we looked at small pocket parks, not big parks or famous parks, but little block parks. And if you have a house or buildings nearby, it increases the real estate about 5 to 15%. What really creates real estate value is you create a neighborhood that people want to live in, work in, visit. And so we did this study, and the study showed that it would cost about $100 million, and that it would bring into the city about $250 million over 20 years. We got both of those numbers very wrong. But they helped us convince, and no one that does these studies actually believes them. 250 million, we said it with a straight face, but no one really believed it. But luckily, our mayor, Bloomberg, was a believer enough that he came on support, and we had a lot of elected officials, and Hillary Clinton was our senator at the time. She was a supporter, and no offense to any elected officials here. But I love this picture because you realize how none of them, they all stand together, but they don't look at each other. I don't know if Dutch politicians do that too. It's a special thing you learn. But even with all that support, it was still going to be torn down because the property owners wanted to tear it down so they could develop the property. Now, this is Grand Central, and it's very famous for, it was a very big preservation battle. But the way they preserved it is they transferred development rights away from the structure into the neighborhood around it. And that's really what saved it. And so that's what we proposed the Bloomberg administration do, is transfer this development right into buildings around it. So this is the rezoning. They rezoned the neighborhood to make it manufacturing, keeping the mid-blocks. It was manufacturing to keep it residential, but kept some of the manufacturing to keep the art galleries that were in the middle there. So, we knew the neighborhood was going to change. The neighborhood was mostly manufacturing. It was going to come residential. So we knew there would be, adjacent development to it. I'll talk a little bit more what actually happened. And so we did a design competition. We didn't, because the advantage, Josh and I weren't designers. So we didn't know what should be up there. And we really wanted the community to decide. So we did a design competition and let people say which they liked. Zaha Hadid, interestingly, when in the competition I said, I don't see any trees. She said, oh, trees are just things architects put when they don't know what to do with the space. So we knew she wasn't right. Stephen Hall wanted a lot of architecture. And the team, James Corner Field Operations and Diller, Skiddy, and Renfro, had this idea of this landscape that was using these modular planks. And I'll get to the real reason to the success, and it is the exact opposite of architecture. But this was their original concept, and actually very much like what was built. You can see how that planking and the planting goes in. But the real secret of the High Line is the planting. And it was designed, it's all thanks to the Dutch. Piet Oldhoff is the planting designer. And he designed this landscape. I asked him if it was a natural landscape, and he said there's nothing natural about it. It's idealized nature. But what it does, like real nature, it does change. Week after week, the plantings look different. And then year to year, I just saw a picture of what it looked like when we opened in 2009. Completely different. And that's how he's designed it, is to constantly be changing. And my favorite quote of Pete's, I didn't have any pictures, but brown is a color too. A lot of what he plants for not what it looks like when it blooms or has leaves, but after it dies. So we've opened it in sections. We still have one more section to open next year. But so it's been wildly more successful than we ever thought. This is a list of about 100 different developments that have grown up around it. And this was also, a lot of these started during sort of a great recession in the US, and one of the worst times. There's this huge development called Hudson Yards that is 18 million square feet. I don't know what the equivalent is, but if you take all the big buildings in Houston, put them all together in one small neighborhood, that's what's going to be built here, and the High Line goes around it. That's this. So this is what the buildings were like, and then we have this massive scale of 100-story buildings. There's also the Whitney Museum has moved, the shed, a lot of different cultural things are moving in and around the High Line. And so the economic impact we got wrong. Now we think it'll be over $2 billion in direct tax revenues to the city over a 20-year time period. But the costs were actually more as well. It cost us about $200 million to build. We also maintain and operate it. It's also, because of so many people, it's gotten more expensive to operate. So what's a little different, we are an NGO, a PPP. We're a private nonprofit, but we only get, now that's an old slide, we only get 1% of our budget from the city. We have to raise all of that privately. And next year it'll be about $16 million. So we also got how many people would come wrong. We thought it would be about 300,000 people a year. We thought that would be a huge success. Last year, we got about 7.5 million. So it's 1 million more than the Metropolitan Museum, 1 million less than the Louvre, which is the most visited museum in the world. But, for example, the Met is 40 times our size. And so that's part of this sort of over-success. We also get an incredible number of tourists. Luckily, the percentage of New Yorkers has shrunk, but luckily the total number has increased. And then one of the things that happened when we first opened is that it was not a diverse population. New York is over 50% non-white, people of color. But when we opened, only 20% of the people coming were minorities. The rest was all white. Now, we've grown that. Now it's about 35. Among New Yorkers, it's at 44%. I'll talk a little bit about how we did that. But what's interesting is there's people concentrate on all the big new development, but there's 2 large public income housing, social housing, I think it's called here. And when we opened, they were not coming to the High Line. And when we asked them why, they said, it was not built for us, we don't see people that look like us, and we don't like your programs. And so we had to completely rethink what we did. And I gave an article once that said that we failed the low-income community in our neighborhood. Quickly, the other newspapers said the whole park was a failure. But I think it is an example of this over-success. One, the amount of development is more than we ever anticipated. 2, it became so crowded that is actually, museums like crowds because they make money when they have more people, or at least in the US we charge, sadly, for our museums. Whereas here, it's just more crowded. The tourists don't mind the crowds, but New Yorkers do. So it means we want to always make sure it's for New Yorkers. So that's why we do hundreds of free programs throughout the year. And we actually now ask the community what programs do they want. Tourists can come for free, but it's really for New Yorkers. This is salsa dancing. We especially do a lot for kids and families, because that's what locals tend to want. We have education programs. We do things with local schools. We hire teens. We help locals participate in the city budgeting process. A lot of volunteers. We also do a lot of art. There's a lot of art in the neighborhood, but it's all in galleries, and most people don't feel comfortable. They don't feel wanted. If they don't feel wanted in a public park, they really don't feel wanted in galleries. So we bring sort of the best of contemporary art onto the park, all for free. We also try to have most of the artists we show, over 50% are women, and most of them are also international. I put this slide up there and I realized we do have the Netherlands. I should have found out which artists. But some of them we do on walls next to the High Line. This is up there right now, an 80-year-old Italian artist. This is with Olafur Eliasson, 1 million pieces of Legos. We just put the Legos out there. That was the art piece. People built new things every day. This is a piece, it says, give your daughter difficult names. It's from a poem. This is the 11 million, there's 11 million immigrants in the US that sadly our president wants to make leave. So this was in solidarity with them. This is not a person, this is actually a sculpture. It was one of some of people's favorites on walls. This is the Simone Lee, who's doing our biggest artwork that we've ever done. It's a sculpture of a bust of a woman she made it in clay, and it's going to be cast in bronze, and it's going to sit right over the street. And she wanted to do it. It's going to be right in the middle of that huge development, which, as she said, it looked like a whole bunch of men's penises. And she wanted this female bust to be there to represent something else. So one of the things that, again, we've done is, people are wanting to build High Lines all over. But I think the most important thing for us of these, when we talk to other people, is what could we do? What could we have done differently? One, in terms of community input, not just asking. Everyone asks design questions, but if you're living on a very low income, you don't care if it's corten steel or aluminum, or if the stair is here nor there. You have other issues, and what we should have asked is, what can we do for you? And that's really where it became a lot about more social programs. The other thing is capturing the value. Once you create a tremendous amount of value, you can't get it back. So the city is making a lot of money, the developers are making a lot of money, we have to keep raising every year the money to support ourselves, we don't get any of that value, and the neighborhood is not getting what it wants, which is more affordable housing. So we created this network of other industrial reuse projects, not to learn from the High Line, but to learn from each other. This is a project called the Beltline. It's a rail line that goes around Atlanta. This is a project in Houston, in Toronto. But this is the project I want you all to know about. It's called the 11th Street Bridge. Again, Dutch designer, OMA, is designing it. It makes the High Line look sort of boring. But the most important part about this project is it connects two neighborhoods. One very wealthy neighborhood in Washington to one, it's a primarily black, lower income neighborhood. And change is coming to that neighborhood. It's going to be gentrified whether they build this bridge or not. But they've made their priority about helping that neighborhood. So before they built the bridge, they've raised $40 million to do a land trust to buy property in that neighborhood. And so it's worth looking at. They have a whole equitable development plan that in a lot of ways the High Line might be innovative in terms of design, but this is the true innovation in terms of thinking about the social issues. So I'm 1 minute over. Oh, we did a project, and I highly, if anybody in the Netherlands wants to bring it here, we did a project where we had 1,000 singers on the High Line, and they were all singing. So it was an opera, but instead of the people moving, you moved through it. And it was all community choruses from across the whole city. It was done, we closed the High Line and did it for 5 different days. But it really helped sort of bring all of New York to the High Line, and then the people represented all of New York. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you.